Boop. Happy Tuesday. Today is Tuesday, June 30th. Can you believe we're at the end of June? Today's daily Bible readings come to us from Psalm 47, 1 Kings 18, 36 through 39, 1 John 4, 1 through 6, or you could have read Psalm 119, 161 through 168, and 1 Kings 21, 17 through 29, and I'm gonna pick up with 1 Kings 21, 17 through 29, and follow up on the story that we started yesterday. In a previous episode, we had the story of Naboth, Ahab, and his wife Jezebel. Ahab was the king of Israel, and his wife Jezebel was not a good person. And Ahab and Jezebel, they're the baddies of baddies in the Old Testament. They're the people that are kind of most remembered for really bringing idolatry into Israel. It was always a problem, always there, but they really kind of institutionalized it, and we're talking about the northern kingdom of Israel, and just really they made a career of it. They were really good at it, and that story yesterday, if you remember, was Ahab set his eyes on this vineyard that Naboth had, and Naboth didn't want to sell it to him. It was part of his family holding, and if you go back and you, like I said, read, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, you realize that all these families, these people had been given their parcels of land, the land that God had promised to them, and they held it very dear, and Naboth did not want to give his inheritance up. Wasn't that he didn't like the king? I don't know, he may have not really liked him. Ahab wasn't a guy you would probably really like. But he didn't want to give his land up. And so Jezebel, well, remember yesterday, Ahab goes and pouts about it. His wife Jezebel, who is really corrupt, figures out this way to bring false testimony against Naboth and have him summarily executed before anybody can figure out what's going on. And once he's out of the picture, killed, done away with, then Ahab just conveniently sweeps in and takes up the land. Well, that's what happens, right? When, people who have absolute power, or think they have absolute power, see things they want, and even if they can't get it, they just take it because they feel like they're justified in it. That's what the story's about. There's a problem, though, right? Somebody will seek out vengeance for the powerless, and that's the story we have here. We have this story of vengeance for Naboth, and that's where we are here in 1 Kings 21, 17 through 19. And in the wake of, through 29 rather, in the wake of this injustice done to Naboth, God sends Elijah with this message for Ahab. And if you remember, Elijah is one of the main prophets. You remember that cool part in the gospel when Jesus is on the mountain with his, like, three of his disciples, and he's transfigured, means he suddenly appears like not normal, and the two big figures that are standing there with him are Moses and Elijah. How they knew that, I don't know. They were probably wearing name tags, maybe some identifying t-shirts, clothing, I don't know. But in the wake of that, Elijah is sent by God. He's God's prophet, the prophet of God. There were lots of prophets at this time, but Elijah is like the man. And he's sent with a message for Ahab. And that message is basically that God will destroy Ahab and his household, just as Ahab and Jezebel have done to Naboth. I'll let you go and read that section because it's quite thrilling what God has in store for Ahab and Jezebel. So the interesting thing, though, is like when Ahab sees Elijah, his response to him, he says, have you found me, my enemy? So Ahab, the king of Israel, calls Elijah his enemy, which is kind of interesting because, my thinking is, of course, in saying that, he is also kind of calling God his enemy as well, because the prophet, it's understood, speaks for God. I mean, we're already told that in this passage, that Elijah has been sent from his home in Tishbite to Ahab with this message. God says, go and tell this guy what I said. And so, to call the prophet of God your enemy is really to decide that, God's your enemy as well. And, because, like I said, the prophet speaks for God. And here's the thing. God speaks to the injustice of power. And that's a really common thread throughout the Old Testament, throughout the prophets. Don't believe me? Go read the prophets. There's a guy named Walter Brueggemann, and he has this great book, little tiny books. And if you're more interested in the prophets Elijah and Elisha, you might want to get a hold of this. But it's called Testimony to Otherwise, the Witness of Elijah and Elisha. And he goes into a discussion about this relationship between Ahab and Elijah. And he says that, there are a couple of things that that Ahab calls, or a couple of different ways that Elijah is referred to, I should say, put it that way. First of all, he's the king's enemy, like we see here. But then he's also called a troubler of Israel. And that's in 1 Kings 18, verse 17. And Brueggemann has this quote in the book that I've lifted out. So it's not my words. This is somebody like much more erudite and learned than I. But Brueggemann says this. He says, "But of course this verdict is on the lips of the king." In other words, it's the king that calls Elijah a troubler of Israel. And then he goes on to say, Elijah does not trouble all of Israel. Rather, he troubles royal, settled, entrenched Israel. He has not respected the present power arrangements, and he enacts a power outside what is taken to be legitimate. In other words, Ahab has a lot of power. He's the king of Israel. And when he says Elijah is a troubler of Israel, he means him. It's kind of like, the idea of the royal we. And here's the thing. It's like, Elijah hasn't really come to trouble everyone in Israel. He's come to trouble Ahab. And Ahab is, granted, in worldly terms, a powerful person. But here's the thing, Elijah serves God, and he doesn't care a whit for this power that Ahab thinks he wields. And he comes and he speaks to that. And that's what Brueggemann means by, he says he enacts a power outside what is taken to be legitimate. He doesn't speak on behalf of any other person. He speaks on behalf of God. And that's the job of the prophet. The job of the prophet is to be, first of all, for God and speak for God. And God isn't often on the side of kings when you read the Old Testament. He's not very often on their side. And like we talked about yesterday, he's not really even in favor of it. He tried to warn the people of Israel what it would be like to have kings. And so, Ahab says to Elijah, "Have you found me, O my enemy?" And Elijah's response is, "Yeah, I found you, you sellout." And that's where the judgment lies. He says, "I found you because you sold out. You have sold yourself in exchange for this power that you desire." He says, "Have you found me, O my enemy?" He answered, "I have found you because you have sold yourself to do what is evil in the sight of the Lord. I will bring disaster on you." That's the job of the prophet, is to speak for God and to speak to power. I've heard in my lifetime a lot of people who like to claim for themselves the prophetic mantle, and even use the title calling themselves prophet or prophetess. And more often than not, they seem to be more interested in just kind of like the honorific, I guess, attitude of that, or being able to, like, I don't know, maybe pretend like they have some mystical power, like, they can tell the future. That's really not what the prophet is to do. If the church were to really honestly regain its role and its prophetic voice, we would be speaking to unjust power much more than we are. And that's a judgment on all of us, me included. Have a good day. We'll see you tomorrow. Boop.